Okay, so I've been working on my new book. It's called Reasonable Doubt, and I finally got the first couple chapters to a place that I'm like really, really happy with just last night. And I thought it would be really cool to share with you guys since I already read books to you to begin with, and it's not something that I have put up anywhere else. So yeah, I don't know if you would let me know like what you think, because I am going for like a specific tone and style, and there's some themes and stuff in there. That I'm trying really hard to develop in a way that's going to be like enjoyable and consistent. So yeah, if you're interested in that, stick around. It's only a couple chapters, and the book probably won't be out till like June or July. Yeah, so like I'm really excited about it, and I'm curious what you think, especially if you like sort of like mystery thrillers. I described the plot to one of my coworkers, and they called it Gone Girl with more people. So if that interests you, stick around. The rain was coming down hard tonight, trickling off the gutters and pooling in the streets below. In the distance, you could hear the low rumble of traffic. From here, the small ocean that had settled into the recess of an overflowing storm drain reflected the light of a neon sign. Nighthawks, and then in much smaller letters, Diner. The reflection waved. It scattered, sent spinning in all directions like the brush strokes of a Van Gogh painting by a miscalculated footstep. She huddled deeper into her wool overcoat and cursed the droplets that fell. Even with the wide brim of her hat taking the brunt of the downpour, it was hard to see, and she kept stepping in puddles. This one was especially deep, and her shoes were now soaked through. The place was a dead ringer for an old Ed Hopper painting of the same name. A short, square little fishbowl plunked down on an awkward street corner, with only a dead mall and a few bleary-eyed patrons for company. Somehow, it had sewn itself into the sidewalk several decades ago, and survived. Soma couldn't help but feel an odd kinship with the place. In the early days, it had been a charming homage to the all-American diner in a small Canadian city, a foreign kidney transplanted into the bustling body of a cute, upscale neighborhood. All shiny chrome, faux leather seats, teal, and checkerboard floors. At some point, in the post-irony decade that followed, it had gotten by catering to a younger, edgier crowd, the pop culture enthusiast. There were experiments with VHS tape plates and servers zooming around on roller skates, but by the time the neighborhood began to show its liver spots, the novelty had faded. What remained were a few choice portraits of gory fast food icons wielding bloody knives and even sharper teeth. Now it sat, forgotten, lonely, while what was left of the neighborhood sputtered and died around it. It had somehow managed to circle back to being nostalgic again, only this time for itself. A cheap plastic replica turned real. Soma was glad to see it. As the door closed behind her, a small bell jingled. Inside, it was bright, warm, inviting. Well, inviting enough. She was just glad to be out of the rain. There weren't that many places left that were open all night and still accepted cash. Water rolled off her and puddled on the grimy tiled floors. Her boots squeaked. A man at the long sit-down counter absent-mindedly stirred sugar into his coffee, and from the kitchen there was a clatter of dishes. Slipping into a booth near the back, she signaled a tired-looking waitress for a cup of coffee. Soma wasn't here to eat, but the warmth always did her creaking joints some good. The waitress obliged with a kind smile that made the fine lines at the corner of her eyes crinkle. Soma wondered if people were born with that easy likability, or if they had to learn to be that way. Even with the weather being what it was, the PI was 15 minutes early, so she settled in to wait. Her clients came in every stripe and color, mostly surveillance work and background checks. If she searched her memory, there were cheating spouses, a custody case or two, a besotted fraud victim, a drunken idiot who had skipped bail, and in very rare circumstances, missing persons cases. A colorful mix of the tragic and mundane. She fought the urge to reach for a tabletop jukebox as the minutes ticked away, eager to open it up and see what kept it ka-chunking along. In the corner, a small TV mounted to the ceiling played reruns on mute. She let herself invent dialogue to go along with the flashing images and sank into an ocean of imaginary sitcom voices and cheesy laugh tracks. It seemed like an appropriate way to pass the time. Just as she was beginning to wonder if he'd show, he squeezed himself into the booth facing her and smiled an apologetic smile. It was as if she'd summoned the poor devil straight from his own personal hell. "Thanks for waiting. I've never been to this part of the city before." So, this was David Novak. He looked like a normal guy with dark, curly brown hair, like a teacher, like a doctor. So family man, you'd hardly even register him if it wasn't for his intensely pale eyes. But she could tell he had aged considerably in a relatively short amount of time. Streaks of gray had begun to set in his hair and beard. He seemed smaller, too, almost pathetic, with his wide-framed glasses pushed awkwardly up the bridge of his nose, at least compared to the press releases and interrogation footage she had seen. His was a forgettable face people had learned to remember. The perfect murder suspect until he wasn't. "You're from August PI, right?" His eyes darted to hers and registered the strangely mechanical way that light reflected off her irises, but he said nothing. If they were synthetic, they were the best implants he'd ever seen, and they must have cost a fortune. He hoped that meant she was good at her job, because right now, he needed her to be the best. There was an uncomfortable moment of silence between them, just long enough for her to realize she was supposed to be talking. Someone had been told her awkwardness could be unsettling at times, so she smiled a wide and friendly smile before continuing. "Yeah, I wanted to meet with you in person. I'm afraid I can't," but before she could finish, he was off on a rambling tangent. It would have been rude to interrupt. If you had asked David Novak, there was a time when he would have told you he had the perfect life. A beautiful wife, intelligent children, and a comfortable home in an upper-middle-class suburb. Sure, he had the usual concerns of a reasonably successful attorney, a husband, and a father of 3. He was the proud owner of a brand-new midnight blue SUV with a check engine light that occasionally flared to life for no conceivable reason, and he often found himself bewildered by his oldest son. Thomas was getting to that age where nothing seemed to please him, and he preferred to keep to himself. It was also true that lately David's wife had been struggling to keep up with the housework, her job, and their children, and most of all, she had been struggling to adjust to the new house, which they had now been living in for almost 3 years. She would often awaken from wordless, terrifying dreams before tossing and turning fitfully in the bed next to him. Sometimes she would wander, sometimes she would scream. She had always been prone to irrational bouts of anger and intense mood swings, so her generally sour mood was less new. Expected, really. But perhaps if he had been more attentive, maybe then he would have seen the end coming. He could not have predicted, of course, how it would end. At the time, he was certain these were all fairly normal challenges, little hiccups here and there, the natural winding down of an established marriage. The couple had already agreed that Jamie would quit her job and begin seeing a therapist once a week. David had insisted, as any good husband would, and it wasn't like they couldn't afford it. He was a top-notch family attorney and a valued member of the community, handsome, articulate, and easygoing with a gift for storytelling. He had been headhunted straight out of university and worked hard at it until he eventually opened up his practice with an old friend. At 34, David was making nearly $115,000 a year and was set to retire comfortably. By all definitions, he had made it. He had the perfect life. At least, he did. The trouble began like any other Tuesday night. David arrived home almost exactly 45 minutes after leaving the office. He had made the same familiar commute so many times over the last 2 years that he had done it down to an almost perfect science. However, when he unlocked the front door, he found the lights off and the house empty. No footsteps as the kids hurtled down the stairs to greet him. No dinner cooking on the stove. No Jamie. just their 6-year-old golden retriever Ginger prancing excitedly while attempting to burrow her large fluffy body into his. Normally, he was the last to arrive home, even on their busiest extracurricular-filled nights. An empty house was unusual. In one hand, he held a stack of unopened mail, and in the other, his car keys. Slightly perturbed, he shuffled through the mail. Junk, mostly. But as the house's emptiness began to weigh on him, he decided to call out, "Jamie? Natalie? Daddy's home," only to be met with a resounding silence and the desperate circle turns of a dog that really needed to pee. As he let the dog outside, a terrible wordless thought began to form. The tiniest hint of doubt. A whisper, a worry. And it nagged at him. It was just that he wasn't used to the silence, he reassured himself. That's all. So, he pulled out his phone and started scrolling through his messages, then the shared family calendar, and finally, he checked the stack of crumpled school field trip forms and newsletters for clues. He was looking for something he'd missed, a school play, a ballet rehearsal, or parent-teacher conference, something to explain away the sense of unease building in the pit of his stomach. And for a moment there was something. Jamie had left a note on the fridge. The letters were small and careful, neat as always. "David, the mechanic shop called. Pickup is for 5:30 today. We will be late. Please start dinner and don't forget to give Ginger her pee pills. Jay." Satisfied with his explanation, he started with the sauce, neatly dicing the carrots and onions while Ginger lay listlessly on the back porch. It was almost peaceful, but as he pulled out a bottle of red, pouring a dash for the sauce and a generous glass for himself, the whisper began to insist. So he sent out a few text messages to his wife and his teenage son. "How far away are you? Dinner's almost ready. Are you on your way? Hello? Jamie?" No response. He didn't like that. The whisper didn't like it. And it was in that moment the garlic began to burn. Cursing the cheap stove burner they'd spent far too much money on, he decided to call, which went straight to voicemail. His calls never went to voicemail. Sauce forgotten, he began to make more calls. To his wife, to his son, over a boiling pot of pasta to the usual auto repair shop. They insisted they didn't have a pickup for one under Jamie Novak, and nothing scheduled for today. A chill went up his spine then. Something had to be terribly wrong. By the time he dialed 911, the table had been neatly arranged for supper. Ginger's food bowl had been filled, and the dinner was cooling on the stove. The time, according to the receiving dispatcher's transcripts, was 7:35 p.m. Not wanting the food to go to waste, he ate dinner alone for the first time in a very long time, and he didn't like the way that felt. When a patrol sergeant finally arrived and received permission to enter, David had eaten 3 bowls of spaghetti and scraped a few leftover meatballs into Ginger's dish. By 10:30, the house was crawling with a dozen cops, and they were just as baffled as David. Calls had been made, but other than a general sense of unease and the lack of Jamie, their kids, or the rental car, there wasn't much to go off of. The beds were made as if Jamie and the kids had every intention of returning that night. They found her purse on the bedroom floor, her wallet on the bed, still holding all her credit cards, and her jacket hanging in the front closet. It was hard to believe she'd left the house without her driver's license, but David reassured them this at least was a normal occurrence. Jamie's forgetfulness had been a constant source of conflict throughout the course of their relationship. On closer inspection, the only things that appeared to be missing, according to David, were a few Christmas presents Jamie had squirreled away in a walk-in closet. However, it was the matching family-sized luggage set, missing 2 or 3 of the suitcases it should have come with, that raised eyebrows with investigators. David hadn't noticed until someone pointed it out. By 11 p.m., the case was turned over to Major Crimes. Officers were sent out to canvass the area, command stations were set up, and an Amber Alert was issued. By the time David collapsed into bed, there was still no news and nothing he could do but sleep. As he closed his eyes, he found himself hoping that this would all prove to be a terrible dream. He wandered through the next couple of days in a fog, responding to emails and phone calls. He stood up in front of news cameras, reading prepared speeches, and humbly accepted the onslaught of shepherd's pies that were awkwardly shoved into his hands. But as the morning light filtered through his windows a week later, he was struck with a cold, clear understanding that chilled him to the bone. This was not a nightmare he would be waking up from anytime soon. It had started so innocently, as most insidious things do, and that was when the story began to fall apart. First, because David hadn't been where he said he was. He'd been late, and he wouldn't tell them where he had been. Second, the police would find the family car at a different mechanic shop, just like it was supposed to be, but under David's name instead. The rental vehicle David described his wife leaving in would be found some days later stolen after being abandoned in a nearby town for 2 or 3 days. Third, although he vividly remembered his wife bundling their kids into the car, the school was quick to forward an email from David informing them the Novak children were home with a fever and chills. Fourth, and maybe worst of all, the suitcases were found in the landfill overflowing with clothes and personal items that belonged to Jamie and the kids. David could only weakly insist he had been downsizing and had thrown it all away just weeks before. It was looking very bad for David. He'd gone from distraught husband and grieving father in the eyes of the media to murder suspect number 1, and it would only get worse. In the end, it was his mistress and a very good lawyer who saved him. All this time, he'd been hiding an affair. The email the school had forwarded was attached to a private account filled with questionable photos, videos, and some pretty salacious declarations of love, along with a semi-regular update on the downward trajectory of David's failing marriage. But it was all time-stamped and easy to access on a few devices found in the home. So it wasn't impossible someone had logged into his account and sent the email on his behalf. And it was pretty impossible for David to have killed his wife and children when he was deep inside of some pressing personal business at the time police estimated Jamie and the kids had disappeared. Lucky for him, he'd recorded his own alibi in graphic detail and uploaded it for his mistress on his way home. Unlucky for him, there was absolutely no way to keep this little detail hidden from the press. The suitcases, it seemed, were just a bizarre coincidence, and the car situation was a little odd, but the single-minded pursuit of David as the one and only real suspect in the disappearance of his family was just enough grounds to get the whole thing thrown out. By the time David was finally cleared, the evidence had been mishandled in such a way that there really weren't any other leads to follow. That whole day was just one big, fat blank. And just like that, the perfectly ordinary life he'd spent the better part of his 20s and 30s building was ripped away within the span of 11 months. Gone. It was all gone, along with his wife, their 2 sons, a 3-year-old daughter, his reputation, and about $15,000 in legal fees. And still, the ultimate question would remain. How could an entire family just disappear? And, more importantly, why? So yeah, that's the first couple chapters. I've still got a bit of a way to go. But I think when I get further, I might continue updating. Because I made my first book mostly free for the beginning of when I put it out, just because I wanted it to be available to as many people as possible. And I'm really excited for this one. I think it's going to be very cool. Yeah, I'd be really curious what you think, or like your interpretation of what might happen, because I'm going for like a mystery. So there's supposed to be like a bit of a plot twist, but I don't want it to be like stupid or like it's too convoluted and then nobody really gets to enjoy it. Yeah, I don't know. I think it would be cool to hear your thoughts and some feedback. If you're curious about my first book, it's called Dear Atlas. I think I have it up on Amazon, Google Play Store, and there's a couple of websites that have ripped it off. And then I think I have it on my Patreon. just as like an EPUB or something. But yeah, I'm really excited about it, and I hope that it is enjoyable for people. So yeah, that was all I wanted to share today.